Hello, and welcome back to my channel. Today we're going to do a draw with me, or a redraw with me, from this old Inktober sketch that I did from last year. This sketch is a combination of the spider, path, and dream prompts. And I really liked how this turned out at the time, and I always wanted to make it a more polished piece, but I just never really got around to it. And since this year I was doing a lot of Inktober animatics, I decided that I wanted to get at least one regular drawing in. So we're going to use this sketch as a basis for our redraw. So come and draw with me as we listen to the tale of Arachne. Arachne was a maiden who became famous throughout all of Greece, even though she wasn't born into a well-off family or beautiful. Nor did she come from a great city. Her father was a humble but incredibly skilled dyer of wool who produced many beautiful shades. The shade that he was most famous for was his bright scarlet, which was the most glorious of all the colors in ancient Greece. But even more skilled than him was his daughter, Arachne. It was her task to spin the fleecy wool into a fine, soft thread and weave it into cloth within the cottage. Arachne was a small, pale young woman with light eyes and dusty brown hair, and despite her being frail, she was still quite quick and graceful. And her fingers, rough as they were, went so fast that it was hard to follow their flickering movements. She used the softest threads, the finest cloth, and her embroidery was gorgeous. And soon her products were well known all over Greece. No one had ever seen anything like it before, and eventually Arachne's fame became so great that people used to come from far and wide just to watch her weave these elaborate designs. Even the graceful nymphs would steal in from a stream or a forest and peep shyly at her in awe and wonder. People would whisper amongst themselves that surely Athena herself must have taught Arachne, because how else could a mortal have attained such a glorious and marvelous talent? Arachne at this point was very used to being marveled at, and she was immensely proud of the skill that brought so many to gaze upon her. Praise was all she lived for, so it displeased her greatly that people would take away from her own talents and achievements and attribute them to some goddess. She would always correct them and say that she gained her talents by working tirelessly to perfect her own craft from morning until night, not standing around watching someone else work. She simply didn't have the time, and even if she did, she certainly wouldn't attribute a fellow mortal's skill to the gods just because their talent was greater than her own. And as for Athena's weaving, how could there be finer cloth and more beautiful embroidery than Arachne's? Arachne declared that if Athena herself came down to compete with her, Arachne would best the goddess. And one day, when Arachne preached the same sentiment to her audience, an old woman appeared from the crowd. She was a frail, poor old woman who was bent leaning on a staff, peering at Arachne. The old woman warned Arachne that she was being foolish and reckless with her words, and wondered how she could dare be so arrogant and claim to be equal to the gods. The woman urged Arachne to take heed of her warning and ask Athena for forgiveness for her disrespect. And of course, Arachne took great offense to this and called the elderly woman foolish and asked how she would even dare to find the gall to speak to her in that manner. Because from Arachne's point of view, it was very apparent that this old woman had never achieved anything great in her life. So what gave her the authority to speak of her talents? Arachne announced that if Athena had any problem with anything she said, she could come down from Olympus herself and challenge her. And at these words, the old woman angrily threw down her staff, straightened her stance, and stood as tall as she could. And as everyone gazed upon this sight, they noticed this old woman grew taller, younger, and fairer, and was soon adorned in long, dazzling white robes. The crowd was overcome with fear as they realized this old woman transformed into Athena, the goddess. Even Arachne was taken aback. She never actually thought the goddess would hear her, but she had come too far now and wasn't going to backpedal on the words that she said. She meant them, so she doubled down and followed through with the challenge she issued Athena. So the two women walked over to the looms and without a word, both began to thread furiously. The room fell silent. All you could hear was the breathing of the audience, the whirring of the shuttles, and the creaking of the wooden frames as each woman pressed their thread into place or tightened the pegs of the loom. The crowd watched and noticed that the skills of both the goddess and the mortal were almost equal. As they continued to watch the events unfold in front of them, they realized that Athena was weaving a warning into her tapestry. A final warning to Arachne. The central figure of Athena's work was the goddess herself competing with Poseidon for possession of the city of Athens. But in the four corners of the tapestry were mortals who had tried to challenge the gods, and the pictures of the awful fate that had overtaken them as a result. The goddess ended a little before Arachne and stood back from her marvelous work to see what the young woman was doing. But before that, while Arachne was working on her piece, she glanced at Athena's work and realized that her skills had been matched. Athena was even a little faster than her. She was shocked since she had never gone against anyone whose skill was equal to hers. And instead of becoming frightened at the fact that she might lose a challenge she issued to a goddess she greatly offended, she became angry, and an evil thought came into her head, which inspired the design in her own work. So whenever Athena finished and stepped back to look at what Arachne was working on, she saw that the maiden had taken for her design a pattern of scenes which showed the evil or unworthy acts of the gods, how they had deceived fair maidens, resorted to trickery, or appeared on earth in the form of poor and humble people, much like what Athena did right before her contest with Arachne. When the goddess saw this insult glowing in the bright colors of Arachne's design, she did not wait for the cloth to be judged. Instead, she stepped forward and tore Arachne's work into pieces, and then she struck Arachne across the face. Arachne stood there, feeling helpless but filled with rage, fear, and pride. She refused to live under such an insult. She cried and took a rope from the wall and tried to hang herself with it, but the goddess stopped Arachne and insisted that she live on. Athena called the girl wicked and commanded her to live on and spend the rest of her days spinning and weaving. When men looked at Arachne, she would serve as an example of what happened to mortals who challenged the gods. It would be a burden for Arachne and all her descendants. And with that, the body of Arachne shriveled up and her legs grew tiny, spindly, and distorted. There, before the eyes of the spectators, hung a dusty, little brown spider on a slender thread. And thus, all spiders descended from Arachne. And the Greek gods would watch them spin their thread and remember the contest with Athena, and thought that it was not right for even the best of mortals to claim equality with the gods. And that is it for part 1 of this redraw. I wasn't able to finish this piece in time for this video, so we just covered the monochromatic version of this painting. As I mentioned, this drawing was based on last year's Inktober prompt, so it has no relation to the story we read today. I just picked the story of Arachne because it fit with the spider theme. If you enjoyed this video, like, subscribe, and let me know how your Inktober went this year. But that will do it for today, so relax if you need to, be productive if you need to. Either way, take care of yourself, and I'll talk to you next time. Bye!